They thought distance would silence me. They thought deployment meant disappearance. They were wrong. My name is Olivia Martinez, and I'm speaking to you from my apartment in Denver, Colorado. But this story begins in the desert heat of Afghanistan, where I received a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever had someone you trusted completely betray you when you were at your most vulnerable? When you were thousands of miles away, risking your life for your country, only to discover that the people you were fighting to protect were busy erasing you from their future? I need you to stay with me through this story because what happened next will show you exactly how karma works when you mess with the wrong soldier. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The temperature outside is dropping fast after another scorching day, and I'm finally getting some downtime after a 16-hour patrol. I've been deployed for 8 months, counting down the days until I can return home to Phoenix, Arizona, to see my family. My phone buzzes with an international call. It's my younger brother, Jake, and his voice sounds strange, almost guilty. Olivia, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how you're going to take this. My heart immediately starts racing. Because when family calls a deployed soldier at 2 a.m., it's never good news. I'm thinking someone died, someone's in the hospital, something catastrophic. Mom and Dad called a family meeting last week. They've updated the will. Now you have to understand something about my family's financial situation. My grandfather, Antonio Martinez, had built a successful construction company from nothing. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left everything to my father with the understanding that it would eventually be divided equally among his 3 grandchildren. That construction business was worth close to $2 million. Plus there was the family home in Scottsdale, rental properties, and various investments. My father had always assured us that everything would be split 3 ways when the time came. Jake, what do you mean they updated the will? I ask, my voice barely above a whisper because I can feel my bunkmates shifting in their sleep nearby. They removed you, Olivia. Completely. Mom said since you're never around anymore and you've made it clear the military is your priority, they didn't see the point in leaving you anything. Emma and I are now the sole beneficiaries. The phone slips from my hand and clatters against the concrete floor of my barracks. For a moment, I can't breathe. I'm sitting in a war zone, wearing 40 pounds of gear that I haven't taken off in hours, exhausted from keeping myself and my squad alive. And my family has decided I don't deserve a future because I chose to serve my country. But Jake isn't finished. There's more, Liv. They signed the papers 3 days ago. Mom specifically said you've become too independent, too distant, and that military life has changed you. She said you don't really need the money anyway since the Army takes care of everything for you. The bitter irony hits me like a physical blow. I'm too independent because I learned to survive in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. I'm too distant because I'm literally on the other side of the world, protecting the freedom they take for granted every single day. I end the call without saying goodbye and sit in the darkness of my bunk, staring at the cement wall. Around me, I can hear the gentle snoring of my fellow soldiers, people who have become my real family over the past few years. These are the people who have my back when bullets are flying, who share their last granola bar when supply runs are delayed, who hold me when I cry after losing a friend to an IED explosion. And my blood family has just told me I don't matter, enough to inherit what my grandfather worked his entire life to build. The next morning, I request a phone call home. When my mother picks up, her voice is artificially cheerful, like she's trying to pretend nothing has happened. Olivia, sweetheart, how are you? We got your last package. The pictures of you and your squad were lovely. Mom, Jake told me about the will. Dead silence. I can hear her breathing change, becoming shallow and defensive. We needed to make some adjustments, honey. You're building your own life now. The military provides for you. Jake and Emma are still finding their way, and they're going to need the support more than you will. I'm finding my way too, Mom. I'm finding my way through a war zone while you're deciding my future without me. My voice cracks slightly, but I push through. Did it occur to you that maybe I might want to come home someday? That maybe I might want to start a family, buy a house, or use that inheritance to build something meaningful? You made your choice, Olivia. You chose the military over us. This is just us accepting reality. The coldness in her voice is something I've never heard directed at me before. This is my mother, the woman who used to pack extra cookies in my school lunch and drive 2 hours to watch me play softball in high school. Now she's talking to me like I'm a stranger who's asking for money. I didn't choose the military over you. I chose to serve my country, and I thought you were proud of that. The line goes quiet again, and I can hear my father's voice in the background, though I can't make out the words. We are proud, sweetie. We just think it's time you stood on your own 2 feet completely. This will be good for you in the long run. I hang up the phone and walk outside into the brutal Afghan heat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony is crushing. I'm literally standing on my own 2 feet in a combat zone, but according to my family, I need to learn independence. I've been financially responsible since I was 16, working part-time jobs through high school and paying my own way through college with scholarships and the GI Bill. I've never asked them for money, never been a burden, never failed to contribute when they needed help. In fact, just 2 years ago, when my father's construction business was struggling during the recession, I sent home half of my deployment pay to help keep the company afloat. $6,000 that I had saved for my future, money I could have used for a down payment on a house or to start my own business when I got out of the military. But I gave it to them because that's what family does. That's what loyalty looks like. Now, apparently, that loyalty is a one-way street. The weeks that followed that phone call were some of the darkest of my deployment. I couldn't focus properly. During missions, and my squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, a tough-as-nails woman from Texas, pulled me aside after I nearly walked into a potential ambush site because my head wasn't in the game. Martinez, what's eating at you? You've been off your game for 2 weeks, and in this place, being off your game gets people killed. I broke down and told her everything. About the will, about my family's decision, about feeling abandoned while I was risking my life for them. She listened without judgment, nodding at all the right moments. Let me tell you something, soldier. Family isn't always blood, and blood isn't always family. The people who have your back when the chips are down, those are your real family. But that doesn't mean you let people walk all over you just because you share DNA. She paused and looked me directly in the eyes. You got any documentation back home about this inheritance stuff? That's when I remembered something crucial. When my grandfather died, he had given each of his grandchildren a copy of his original will, along with a letter explaining his wishes. He had been very specific about wanting his legacy to be divided equally among his grandchildren, regardless of what paths we chose in life. I had kept those documents in a safety deposit box back in Phoenix, along with my other important papers. Sergeant, I think I might have some leverage I forgot about. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. My grandfather left me a copy of his original will, and it specifically states that his assets should be divided equally among his grandchildren. My parents are executors, but they're not supposed to have the power to completely disinherit one of the beneficiaries. Now you're thinking like a soldier. You don't retreat, you regroup, and you fight smarter. She clapped me on the shoulder. When you get back stateside, you make sure those people understand that messing with a combat veteran is not a smart move. I spent the next few months of my deployment researching inheritance law during my downtime, reaching out to military, legal assistance, and preparing for the battle I knew was coming when I returned home. The legal assistance officer, Captain Williams, was incredibly helpful in explaining my rights and options. Olivia, If your grandfather's original will specifically named you as a beneficiary with equal share, and if your parents are acting as executors rather than inheriting the estate themselves, they may not have the legal authority to remove you without proper cause and legal proceedings. She handed me a folder full of information. You'll need to get a civilian attorney when you return, but you definitely have grounds to contest this. The knowledge that I had legal recourse gave me the strength to finish my deployment with renewed focus. I threw myself into my duties, completed several successful missions, and even received a commendation for bravery after helping to evacuate wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Every day, I reminded myself that I was fighting for something bigger than my family's betrayal. But I also promised myself that I wouldn't let them get away with what they had done. My parents continued to call occasionally, but the conversations were stilted and uncomfortable. They would ask about my deployment, share news about Jake and Emma, and completely avoid any mention of the will or the inheritance. It was as if they thought that by not talking about it, they could make it disappear. They had no idea that I was planning my counterattack. Emma called me once, about a month before I was scheduled to return home. She sounded nervous and unsure of herself. Olivia, I want you to know that I didn't ask for this. When Mom and Dad told me about the changes to the will, I was shocked. I tried to argue with them, but they said it was already decided. Emma, if you really disagreed with it, you could have refused to accept the terms. You could have insisted that I be included. My voice was calm, but inside I was furious. Emma had always been the peacemaker in our family, but when it came to money, she had chosen her own financial security over what was right. It's not that simple, Liv. They're my parents too, and they made it clear that if I didn't support their decision, there might not be anything left for me either. The threat was implicit but clear. Fall in line or lose everything. I'm hoping that when you come home, we can all sit down and work something out. There's nothing to work out, Emma. Either I'm part of this family and entitled to what Grandpa left for me, or I'm not. There's no middle ground. I ended the call feeling more resolved than ever. My family had shown their true colors, and now it was time for me to show mine. The day finally came when I boarded the plane to leave Afghanistan. As the aircraft lifted off from Bagram Airfield, I watched the desert landscape disappear beneath the clouds and felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. I was going home, but I wasn't the same person who had left Phoenix 14 months earlier. I had been tested by combat, betrayed by family, and forged into someone who wouldn't back down from a fight. During the long flight home, with multiple stops and connections, I had plenty of time to think about my strategy. I wasn't going to call my parents immediately. I wasn't going to show up at their door demanding explanations. Instead, I was going to handle this like a military operation. Gather intelligence, secure my resources, and then strike decisively. My first stop after landing in Phoenix was the bank where I had my safety deposit box. The box contained documents from my grandfather's estate, including the original will that clearly stated his intentions for his legacy. As I read through the papers, my grandfather's words came back to me clearly. I want my grandchildren to know that their inheritance is not a gift to be given or taken away by their parents. It is their birthright, earned by being part of this family, regardless of what paths they choose in life. The will was explicit. Each grandchild was to receive an equal share of the estate upon reaching the age of 25 or upon the death of both parents, whichever came first. There were no conditions about career choices, no requirements about staying close to home, no stipulations about approval from the executors. My parents had authority to manage the estate until distribution, but they did not have the right to change the fundamental terms of inheritance. I made copies of everything and secured the originals in a new safety deposit box at a different bank. Then I made an appointment with a civilian attorney who specialized in estate law. Attorney Michael Thompson was a former military officer, himself, and when I explained my situation, his expression grew increasingly serious. Olivia, What your parents have done is not only morally questionable, it's potentially illegal. As executors, they have a fiduciary duty to carry out the terms of the will as written, not to modify them based on their personal preferences. He reviewed the documents I had brought. This is a clear case of executor misconduct, and you have excellent grounds for legal action. What are my options? I asked, feeling more confident than I had in months. We can file a petition with the probate court to remove your parents as executors and to enforce the original terms of the will. We can also potentially pursue damages for any financial losses you've suffered due to their actions. He paused and looked at me seriously. However, I want you to understand that this will likely destroy your relationship with your family permanently. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought about all the nights I had spent in Afghanistan, wondering if I would ever see my family again. I thought about the money I had sent home to help their business, the birthdays and holidays I had missed while serving my country, the sacrifices I had made in the name of family loyalty. Then I thought about how easily they had erased me from their future while I was risking my life for them. Mr. Thompson, they destroyed the relationship when they cut me out of the will. I'm just making sure they face the consequences of that decision. The foundation of betrayal was laid long before I ever put on a uniform. Growing up in the Martinez household meant understanding your role and staying in it. I was the responsible one, the achiever, the daughter who never caused problems. Jake was the charming one who could talk his way out of anything, and Emma was the baby who everyone protected and coddled. These weren't just personality traits we developed naturally, they were roles assigned to us by our parents and reinforced every single day. I remember being 12 years old and coming home from school to find my mother crying at the kitchen table, bills spread out in front of her like tarot cards predicting doom. My father's construction business was going through a rough patch, and money was tight. Instead of sitting me down and explaining that sometimes families go through difficult periods, my mother looked at me with those tear-filled eyes and said something that would shape the next 15 years of my life. Olivia, you're the smart one in this family. You're going to need to help us figure out how to make things work. At 12, I didn't understand that she was placing an enormous burden on a child. I just knew that my mother needed me, and I would do whatever it took to help. I started babysitting neighbors' kids after school, saving every penny to contribute to the household expenses. I got a paper route. I tutored other students for small fees. While other kids my age were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, I was learning that my value in the family was directly tied to my ability to solve problems and contribute financially. This pattern continued throughout my teenage years. When Jake got arrested for underage drinking at 16, who do you think had to use her college savings to pay for the lawyer? When Emma needed a car for her senior year but my parents couldn't afford the insurance, who worked double shifts at the local diner to cover the extra costs? Every time there was a crisis, every time someone needed rescuing, I was expected to step up and handle it. The irony is that my parents were incredibly proud of my sense of responsibility. They would brag to their friends about how mature and capable I was, how they never had to worry about me because I always did the right thing. What they failed to recognize was that they had created a dynamic where I had no choice but to be responsible, because the entire family's stability seemed to rest on my shoulders. My grandfather Antonio was the only one who ever questioned this arrangement. During family dinners, he would watch the interactions carefully, and I could see him frowning when my parents would casually mention that I was paying for something or handling some family problem. One evening, when I was 17, he pulled me aside after dinner. "Mija, you know you don't have to carry the whole world on your shoulders, right?" He spoke in the gentle Spanish-accented English that I had grown up hearing, his weathered hands resting on my shoulders. "Your parents, they love you. But sometimes people forget that children should get to be children. I don't mind helping, abuelo. We're family." The response came automatically because that's what I had been taught to say, but he shook his head slowly. "Family means everyone helps everyone. not one person carrying everyone else. You remember that when you're older, okay? You remember that you deserve to be taken care of, too. He pressed a folded $20 bill into my hand. This is just for you, not for bills, not for your brother or sister, just for something that makes you happy. I had cried that night, holding that $20 bill and realizing it was the first money anyone had ever given me that didn't come with expectations or obligations attached. My grandfather understood something that my parents never did. I was drowning in responsibility, and no one was throwing me a life preserver. When it came time for college, I qualified for several scholarships based on my grades and extracurricular activities. I had worked incredibly hard throughout high school, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working part-time jobs and managing family crises. The scholarships would cover most of my tuition and expenses, but I still needed help with room and board. Jake was 2 years younger than me, and Emma was still in middle school, so logically, you would think my parents would have been able to focus their financial resources on helping me get through college. Instead, my father sat me down and explained that the construction business was expanding and they needed to invest every available dollar into new equipment and contracts. You're smart enough to figure it out, Olivia. You always land on your feet. Jake and Emma are going to need more help when their time comes. Even then, even when I was 18 and about to leave for college, my future was being sacrificed for my siblings' theoretical future needs. That's when I first seriously considered military service. The recruiter who came to our high school career fair painted a picture of opportunity, education benefits, and the chance to serve something greater than yourself. The GI Bill would cover my college expenses completely, and I would graduate, debt-free, with real-world experience and discipline that would serve me for the rest of my life. My parents were surprisingly supportive of the idea, though I suspect their enthusiasm had more to do with removing a financial burden than genuine belief in my military aspirations. The military will be good for you, my mother said. You'll get to see the world, and you won't have to worry about money. What she didn't say, but what I heard clearly, was that I also wouldn't be around to be their go-to problem solver anymore. I enlisted in the Army as a military police officer, drawn to the law enforcement aspect and the promise of developing leadership skills. Basic training was tough, but not as tough as growing up in a household where I was expected to be the adult while still being treated like a child when it came to having any real voice in family decisions. During my first deployment to Iraq, I sent half of my hazard pay home to help with Jake's college expenses. He had chosen an expensive private school and was majoring in something impractical like art history, but my parents insisted that he needed the full college experience that apparently I didn't require. I justified it to myself by saying that I was single, living on base, and didn't need much money anyway. Looking back, I realize I was still playing the same role I had always played, sacrificing my own interests for the family's benefit. The pattern continued when I returned from Iraq and was stationed at Fort Bragg. Jake had dropped out of college after 2 years and was living at home, supposedly working for my father's construction company, but mostly just showing up when he felt like it. Emma had graduated high school and was taking a gap year to find herself, which seemed to involve a lot of expensive trips and shopping sprees funded by my parents. Meanwhile, I was sending money home regularly to help with what my parents described as temporary financial difficulties. The construction business was struggling again, and my father's pride prevented him from downsizing or adapting to market changes. Instead of facing reality, he kept taking on projects that lost money, borrowing against the business assets, and relying on my contributions to keep things afloat. I remember one particularly frustrating phone call where my mother explained that they were behind on the mortgage for their house in Scottsdale. This wasn't the modest family home where I had grown up. This was the upgraded house they had bought when the business was doing well, a sprawling 5-bedroom place with a pool and a 3-car garage in an upscale neighborhood. We might lose the house, Olivia. Your father is too proud to ask, but we're really struggling. The guilt was heavy in her voice, But there was also an expectation that I would step in and solve the problem like I always did. If you could help us with just a few payments, just until things turn around. I had been saving money for a down payment on my own house, something modest near the base where I could build equity instead of throwing money away on rent. But faced with the possibility of my parents losing their home, I transferred $6,000 to help catch up their mortgage payments. $6,000 that represented months of careful saving, months of living in cramped base housing, and eating at the chow hall instead of going out with friends. The gratitude was effusive but temporary. Within 3 months, they needed help again. This time, it was Emma's college tuition. She had finally decided to enroll in school, but instead of starting at a community college or state university like a sensible person would do when money was tight, she had set her heart on an expensive private college in California. She's worked so hard to get accepted, and she's never asked for anything, my mother pleaded over the phone. This was objectively untrue. Emma had asked for plenty over the years, and usually received whatever she wanted. We don't want her to miss this opportunity because of money. I pointed out that there were plenty of good schools that cost less, that Emma could start at a community college and transfer, that there were numerous ways to get an education without going into massive debt. But my practical suggestions were dismissed as being unsupportive of Emma's dreams. In the end, I contributed another $4,000 to Emma's first-year tuition, money I had earmarked for my own professional development courses. The most painful part wasn't the money itself, it was the complete lack of recognition for what I was sacrificing. My family talked about Emma's college dreams as if they were sacred, but no one ever asked about my dreams. No one wondered if I might want to buy a house, start a business, or save for my own future. I had become so identified with the role of provider and problem solver that my own aspirations had become invisible, even to myself. When my grandfather died, I was devastated, not just because I loved him, but because I felt like I was losing, the only person who had ever seen me as more than just a resource to be tapped when needed. The funeral service was beautiful, filled with stories of his generosity, his work ethic, and his devotion to family. Several people mentioned how proud he had been of my military service, how he had bragged about his granddaughter who was serving her country overseas. After the service, my father gathered the family together to discuss the inheritance. My grandfather had been quite wealthy by the time he died. The construction company he had built was worth nearly $2 million. Plus, there was the family, home, several rental properties, and various investments and savings accounts. The total estate was valued at close to $3.5 million. Dad wanted this to be divided equally among his grandchildren, my father announced, reading from the will. Each of you will receive an equal share when you turn 25, or when both your mother and I pass away, whichever comes first. At the time, I was 22, Jake was 20, and Emma was 18. The inheritance would provide each of us with over $1 million, enough to start adult life with genuine financial security. I remember feeling a profound sense of relief and gratitude, not because of the money itself, though that was certainly life-changing, but because it felt like validation from my grandfather that I was valued as an individual, not just as the family's designated caretaker. For the first time in my adult life, I had a financial future that didn't depend on sacrificing everything for other people's needs. My parents were appointed as executors of the estate, responsible for managing the assets until the beneficiaries came of age. This seemed natural since my father had been running the construction company and understood the business better than any of us. The understanding was that they would continue operating the company, maintain the properties, and preserve the value of the estate until it was time for distribution. What I didn't anticipate was how the inheritance would change the family dynamic. Suddenly, Jake and Emma began talking about their futures with a confidence and entitlement that I had never been able to afford. Jake announced that he was going to use his inheritance to start his own business, something involving cryptocurrency and online trading that sounded dubious but expensive. Emma began making plans for graduate school and a lifestyle that assumed unlimited financial resources. Meanwhile, I continued sending money home whenever my parents asked for help. The construction business was still struggling, and my father explained that they needed to be careful with the estate assets, so any immediate financial needs would have to come from other sources. Translation: I needed to keep being the family ATM while the inheritance sat untouched in investment accounts. The requests became more frequent and more significant after my grandfather's death. My parents seemed to feel more comfortable asking for larger amounts, perhaps because they knew that eventually I would inherit money and they could frame their requests as advances on my future wealth. But the inheritance was still years away, and my current financial situation was being drained by their ongoing needs. When I received orders for deployment to Afghanistan, my family's reaction was mixed. They were proud of my service, genuinely concerned for my safety, and also clearly worried about losing their most reliable source of financial support. The conversations before I left were filled with promises to be more careful with money, assurances that they would be fine while I was gone, and subtle requests for me to set up automatic transfers to help with ongoing expenses. I agreed to send money regularly because I genuinely believed that my family was struggling and that I had a moral obligation to help. I also believed that when I returned from deployment, things would be different. I would be older, more experienced, and ready to start building my own life with the support and understanding of a family that appreciated my sacrifices. Looking back, I can see how naive I was. I had spent my entire adult life training my family to see me as a resource rather than a person, and they had become comfortable with that arrangement. The idea that I might eventually want to prioritize my own needs and dreams was not something they had ever seriously considered. The phone call from Jake about the will was devastating, but it wasn't completely surprising. In some deep part of my mind, I had always known that my family's love came with conditions and expectations. What I hadn't realized was how quickly that love could be withdrawn when I was no longer physically present to meet their needs and demands. The worst part was the reasoning they gave for cutting me out of the inheritance. According to my mother, I had become too independent, too focused on my military career, and too distant from the family. The irony was suffocating. I had become independent because they had forced me to be self-reliant from childhood. I was focused on my military career because it was the only path that had ever offered me genuine opportunities without strings attached. And I was distant because I was literally on the other side of the world, serving my country in a war zone. But underneath their stated reasons, I could hear the real truth. They had gotten used to my money without having to share power or decision-making authority with me. They liked having access to my financial resources while being able to make plans and choices without considering my input or interests. Cutting me out of the inheritance allowed them to maintain that dynamic permanently. Jake and Emma would inherit everything, but they would remain dependent on my parents' guidance and approval. They would be wealthy, but they would never be truly independent, because their wealth would come through my parents' management and distribution. I, on the other hand, had developed real independence and capability, which made me dangerous to the family power structure they wanted to maintain. The more I thought about it during those dark weeks in Afghanistan, the more I realized that this betrayal was the logical culmination of patterns that had been established decades earlier. I had been groomed from childhood to give without receiving, to sacrifice without acknowledgement, and to accept whatever scraps of affection were offered in return for my service to the family's needs. Now they were making it official. I was not really family in the sense that mattered. I was a useful resource who had outlived her usefulness and could be discarded without guilt or regret. The fact that I was risking my life in military service while they were making these decisions just added an extra layer of cruelty to the betrayal. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. They saw me as the compliant daughter who always gave in, always stepped up, always put family needs ahead of her own interests. They didn't recognize that military service had taught me to fight strategically, to gather intelligence before taking action, and to never surrender when you know you're in the right. I had documentation that they didn't know about. I had legal rights that they hadn't considered. And most importantly, I had reached a point where I was finally ready to stop sacrificing my own interests for people who had never truly appreciated those sacrifices. The war in Afghanistan had taught me many things about survival, strategy, and the importance of choosing your battles carefully. But perhaps the most valuable lesson was that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who know your weaknesses and vulnerabilities because you trusted them with that information. My family thought they knew me. They thought they could predict my responses and control my choices because they had been doing it successfully for my entire life. But they were about to discover that the compliant, self-sacrificing daughter they had taken for granted no longer existed. I had been forged in combat, tested by betrayal, and hardened by the knowledge that the people I had loved most in the world had been willing to discard me the moment I was no longer convenient. That realization was painful, but it was also liberating, because it freed me from the obligation to protect people who had never intended to protect me. The remainder of my deployment passed with a new sense of clarity and purpose. I threw myself into my duties with renewed focus, earned commendations for my performance, and began planning for a future that would be entirely under my own control. I also began documenting everything meticulously, gathering evidence and preparing for the legal battle I knew was coming. My family continued to call occasionally, maintaining the pretense that nothing had changed, that I was still the beloved daughter and sister who would eventually come home and resume my role as the family's financial safety net. They had no idea that I was done with that role permanently, or that I had the documentation and legal standing to enforce my grandfather's actual wishes rather than their revised version of his legacy. The countdown to my return home became a countdown to justice. Every day brought me closer to the moment when I would walk into my family's comfortable assumptions and shatter them completely. They thought distance and time would make me accept their decision. They were about to learn that some wounds don't heal, they calcify into armor. And some betrayals don't fade, they transform into unbreakable resolve. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small moments of clarity that accumulated like drops of water eventually carving through stone. I started paying attention to conversations differently, listening not just to what my family said but to what they didn't say, watching their body language, analyzing their motivations with the same tactical awareness I use to assess potential threats in combat situations. The first crack in my old understanding came during a video call with Emma about 3 weeks after Jake had delivered the devastating news about the will. She was sitting in what had been my childhood bedroom, now converted into her personal workspace, surrounded by expensive equipment that I knew my parents couldn't afford. Ring lights, professional cameras, multiple monitors, editing software that cost thousands of dollars. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was using the room, where I had spent countless nights doing homework and planning my escape from the family's financial chaos. "I'm launching my lifestyle brand," she announced with the breathless excitement of someone who had never faced real consequences for failure. "I've got sponsorship deals lined up, and Mom thinks I could make 6 figures within the first year." She gestured around the room as if it were a television studio rather than a bedroom in our parents' house. The initial investment was pretty significant, but you know how Mom and Dad are about supporting our dreams. The casual way she said "our dreams" hit me like a physical blow. Our dreams. As if my dreams had ever been supported, as if my aspirations had ever been funded, as if anyone had ever invested thousands of dollars in my potential for success. I had joined the military partially because it was the only way I could afford to pursue higher education. And here was Emma talking about 5-figure investments in equipment for her social media venture, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Where did the money come from for all that equipment?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Through years of military training, I had learned to gather intelligence without revealing my suspicions or intentions. Emma's eyes flickered slightly, a tell that she was about to lie or deflect. "Oh, Mom and Dad have been saving up. The construction business has been doing better lately." This was interesting because just 2 months earlier, my mother had called me crying about potential bankruptcy and asking for another emergency loan to cover payroll. "That's great to hear. I was worried after Mom's last call about the financial situation." I watched Emma's face carefully as I spoke, noting the slight tightening around her eyes, the way she shifted in her chair. "Well, you know how Mom is. She tends to dramatize things when she gets stressed." The dismissive tone in Emma's voice revealed something crucial. Either my mother had been lying to me about the severity of their financial problems to manipulate me into sending money, or Emma was completely unaware of the family's real financial situation because she was being protected from that reality while I was being burdened with it. After the call ended, I sat in my barracks staring at the concrete wall and processing what I had just learned. The equipment Emma was showing off represented more money than I had ever seen my parents spend on anything for me. When I had wanted to take advanced placement classes in high school that required special textbooks, I was told we couldn't afford them, and I needed to work extra hours to pay for them myself. When I had been accepted to a summer leadership program that could have boosted my college applications, the program fee was deemed too expensive, and I was encouraged to get a job instead. But Emma's dreams were worth a 5-figure investment, apparently funded by the same parents who claimed to be struggling financially and regularly asked me for emergency assistance. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. My parents had money when they wanted to spend it on certain things, but never when it came to investing in my future or supporting my goals. I began reviewing my bank statements with a new perspective, calculating exactly how much money I had sent home over the years. The numbers were staggering. In the 4 years since my grandfather's death, I had transferred over $47,000 to my parents. That didn't include the money I had sent during my first deployment, or the various smaller amounts I had provided for emergencies, gifts, and special occasions. $47,000 that could have been a down payment on a house, seed money for my own business, or investment in graduate education. Instead, it had disappeared into the black hole of my family's lifestyle maintenance while I lived in military housing and drove a used car that was older than my youngest sibling. The mathematical reality was brutal, but it was also illuminating. I had been financing their ability to cut me out of my inheritance. My own money had been used to stabilize their situation enough that they felt comfortable removing my future financial security. The symmetry was almost artistic in its cruelty. I started asking more pointed questions during our weekly calls, probing gently but persistently about their finances, their plans, their decision-making process. My parents had grown comfortable with my passive acceptance of their requests and explanations, so they weren't prepared for systematic questioning from someone trained in interrogation techniques. "Dad, you mentioned last month that the business was having cash flow problems, but Emma showed me all the new equipment you bought for her. How did you manage to free up that capital?" The question was phrased professionally, without accusation or emotion, just a daughter seeking to understand her family's financial situation. My father's response was a masterpiece of deflection and contradiction. "Well, sweetie, business finances are complicated. We had some unexpected income from an old contract, and your mother really wanted to support Emma's entrepreneurial spirit. You know how important it is to invest in our children's futures." The phrase, "our children's futures," was particularly galling because it clearly didn't include me. I was apparently not part of our children when it came to investment and support, despite being the child who had contributed most significantly to the family's financial stability over the years. "That's wonderful that you're able to support Emma's business venture. I remember when I wanted to take those certification courses for project management a few years ago, you mentioned that the family budget couldn't absorb that kind of expense." I kept my tone conversational, almost reminiscent, as if I were simply recalling an old memory rather than highlighting a glaring double standard. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. When my father finally responded, his voice had a defensive edge that I had never heard directed at me before. "Olivia, your situation is different. You have the military paying for your training and education. Emma doesn't have those resources available to her." This rationalization was so fundamentally flawed that I had to pause to control my response. Emma lived rent-free in their house, had no job or independent income, and was being supported entirely by our parents while pursuing her social media dreams. I, on the other hand, was risking my life in a combat zone while sending home significant portions of my military pay to support the family's lifestyle. But more importantly, the military benefits my father was dismissing so casually were benefits I had earned through service, sacrifice, and personal risk. I hadn't been handed opportunities, I had earned them through my own choices and commitment. The idea that this somehow made me less deserving of family support or investment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of fairness and reciprocity. That night, I called my military legal assistance office and scheduled an appointment to discuss inheritance law and executor responsibilities. Captain Sarah Williams, the legal assistance officer, was a sharp woman in her early 30s who had left a successful civilian law practice to serve in the military. Her office walls were covered with legal certifications and military commendations, and she had a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising when it came to service members' rights. "Olivia, tell me about your grandfather's will and your family's current handling of the estate." Her notebook was already open, pen poised to take detailed notes. Military legal assistance might be free, but it was also professional and comprehensive. I explained the situation systematically, starting with my grandfather's explicit wishes for equal distribution among his grandchildren, the appointment of my parents as executors, and their recent decision to modify the terms of inheritance without legal proceedings or beneficiary consent. Captain Williams listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, amounts, and specific language used in conversations. "Do you have a copy of the original will?" she asked, and I confirmed that I had secured the documents my grandfather had given me directly. "That's excellent. Executors have significant authority to manage estate assets, but they don't have unlimited power to change the fundamental terms of inheritance, especially when those terms are clearly stated and the beneficiaries are specifically named." She pulled out several legal reference books and began researching Arizona state laws regarding estate administration and executor misconduct. "What your parents have done may constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. As executors, they're legally obligated to carry out the testator's wishes as expressed in the will, not to substitute their own judgment about who deserves what." The legal terminology was validating in a way that family conversations had never been. In the military legal system, there were clear rules, defined responsibilities, and consequences for people who abused their authority. The subjective, emotional manipulation that had characterized my family relationships for years simply didn't exist in this environment. "What are my options for legal recourse?" I asked, finally allowing myself to hope that there might be a path forward that didn't require me to accept my family's betrayal as inevitable. Captain Williams outlined several possibilities, ranging from formal complaints to the probate court to complete removal of my parents as executors. The strongest approach would be to petition the court to enforce the original terms of the will and potentially seek damages for any financial harm you've suffered due to their mismanagement of their fiduciary duties. "What about the money? I've sent them over the years. Can that be recovered as part of the estate dispute?" This was the question I had been afraid to ask, partly because it seemed too good to be true, and partly because it made the family betrayal feel even more calculated and cruel. If you can document that they solicited financial assistance from you while simultaneously planning to remove you from your inheritance, that could potentially be construed as fraudulent behavior. At minimum, it would demonstrate a pattern of bad faith in their handling of family financial matters. She made more notes, her expression growing increasingly serious. Olivia, I want you to understand that pursuing this legally will likely result in permanent damage to your family relationships. Are you prepared for that possibility? The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Was I prepared to lose my family permanently? The honest answer was that I felt like I had already lost them. The people who could cut me out of an inheritance while I was deployed, who could accept my financial support while planning to exclude me from my grandfather's legacy, who could rationalize their betrayal by claiming I was too independent. These weren't people who truly loved me. They were people who had found me useful and were now discarding me because that usefulness had become inconvenient. Captain, I think they already made the decision to damage our relationship permanently when they changed the will. I'm just deciding whether to accept that damage passively or respond to it strategically. My voice was steady, but inside I felt something fundamental shifting, like tectonic plates moving deep underground before an earthquake becomes visible on the surface. She nodded approvingly. That's a mature way to look at it. Let me give you some homework. I want you to document every financial transaction you've had with your family over the past 5 years. Bank transfers, receipts, email requests for money, text messages about loans or assistance. Also, write down every conversation you remember about the inheritance, including dates, witnesses, and specific language used. I left her office with a folder full of legal information and a new sense of purpose. For the first time since Jake's devastating phone call, I felt like I had some control over the situation. I wasn't just a victim of my family's manipulation, I was a strategic opponent, with legal standing and documentary evidence. The process of compiling my financial history with my family was both enlightening and infuriating. I had been meticulous about record-keeping throughout my military career, so I had bank statements, email archives, and phone records that painted a comprehensive picture of years of one-sided financial support. The pattern was unmistakable. Every few months, there would be a crisis call or email from one of my parents, followed by a large transfer from my account to theirs. The reasons varied: medical emergencies, business shortfalls, home repairs, educational expenses, but the solution was always the same. Olivia would handle it. Olivia would sacrifice her own financial goals to solve the family's immediate problems. But what struck me most powerfully was the complete absence of reciprocity. In 5 years of detailed financial records, there wasn't a single instance of my parents offering financial assistance to me. Not when I needed to buy a reliable car for my commute to base. Not when I wanted to take professional development courses that weren't covered by military benefits. Not when I had mentioned wanting to start building credit by getting my own apartment off base. The relationship had been entirely extractive. They took my money, my time, my emotional energy, and my problem-solving abilities, but they never invested in my future or supported my goals. I had been so conditioned to see this as normal family behavior that I had never recognized it as exploitation. I began researching my family's actual financial situation using the investigative skills the military had taught me. Public records showed that my father's construction business had several outstanding liens and had been in financial difficulty for years longer than they had admitted to me. Property records revealed that they had refinanced their house multiple times, extracting equity to fund their lifestyle while building unsustainable debt. Most tellingly, I discovered that the estate assets my grandfather had left were actually performing quite well under professional management. The construction company was profitable when it wasn't being mismanaged by my father's poor business decisions. The rental properties were fully occupied and generating steady income. The investment accounts had grown significantly over the past 5 years. This meant that the financial crises my parents had been asking me to solve weren't actually threatening the estate or my siblings' inheritance. They were only threatening my parents' ability to maintain their personal lifestyle and cover my father's business mistakes. My money had been used to subsidize their choices while protecting the assets that would eventually go to Jake and Emma. The deliberate calculation of this arrangement was breathtaking. They had preserved the inheritance for my siblings while using my contributions to cover their own financial irresponsibility. Then they had justified cutting me out of the will by claiming I was too independent and didn't need family support, even though my independence had been forced upon me by their refusal to provide the same financial cushion they were maintaining for Jake and Emma. I spent several nights staring at the ceiling of my barracks, processing the full scope of what had been done to me. This wasn't just about money, though the financial betrayal was significant enough on its own. This was about a lifetime of conditioning me to accept less, sacrifice more, and be grateful for whatever scraps of affection were offered in return for my service to everyone else's needs. My grandfather had tried to protect me from this dynamic by ensuring I would have independent financial security through his inheritance. He had recognized that I was carrying an unfair burden and wanted to give me the resources to build my own life on my own terms. My parents had effectively stolen that protection and used my own contributions to make the theft possible. The rage I felt was clean and focused, unlike the confused hurt I had experienced initially. This was the kind of anger that could be channeled into effective action, the kind of righteous fury that military training had taught me to harness for mission accomplishment. My mission now was to reclaim what my grandfather had intended for me and ensure that my parents faced consequences for their betrayal. I scheduled another appointment with Captain Williams to review my compiled evidence and discuss next steps. Her reaction to my documentation was professionally impressed and personally outraged. "Olivia, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of financial exploitation I've seen. The paper trail you've assembled would make any civil attorney very confident about pursuing this case." "What's the strongest legal approach?" I asked, ready to hear about aggressive tactics and comprehensive litigation strategies. Honestly, the most effective approach might be the simplest one. File a petition with the probate court to enforce the original terms of your grandfather's will. Include your documentation of the financial support you've provided and the timeline of their decision to exclude you from inheritance. Let the facts speak for themselves. She leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require you to prove malicious intent or elaborate conspiracy. You just have to demonstrate that they're not fulfilling their legal obligations as executors. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I was scheduled to return from deployment in 6 weeks, and I wanted to have a clear plan of action ready for implementation. If you file the petition promptly after returning stateside, you could have a court hearing within 60 to 90 days. Estate law moves relatively quickly because courts recognize that delayed resolution causes ongoing harm to beneficiaries. She handed me a referral list of civilian attorneys who specialized in estate litigation. I'd recommend consulting with a specialist as soon as you get back to the States. Military legal assistance can provide guidance, but you'll need civilian representation for actual court proceedings. I folded the referral list carefully and placed it in my secure document folder along with all my other evidence. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving toward a solution rather than just enduring an impossible situation. The remainder of my deployment passed with a new sense of anticipation. I continued my duties with professional competence, but my real focus was on preparing for the legal battle that awaited me back home. I refined my documentation, researched potential attorneys, and mentally rehearsed the conversations I would need to have with my family once legal proceedings began. My parents continued to call occasionally, maintaining their pretense that nothing fundamental had changed in our relationship. They asked about my deployment, shared family news, and avoided any mention of the inheritance or their decision to exclude me. The cognitive dissonance of these conversations was remarkable. They seemed to genuinely believe that they could betray me financially while maintaining normal family relationships in all other areas. Jake called once, about 2 weeks before my scheduled return, and his tone was different, nervous, almost guilty. "Liv, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I want you to know that I feel weird about the will situation. I didn't ask for them to cut you out. But you're not refusing the inheritance either, I pointed out, keeping my voice neutral and observational rather than accusatory. It's complicated. You know how Mom and Dad are. If I fight them on this, they might change their minds about everything. His honesty was refreshing, even though his moral cowardice was disappointing. I was hoping that when you get back, maybe we could all sit down and work something out as a family. Jake, they already worked something out as a family. They just didn't include me in the family when they made that decision. I could hear him sigh heavily over the international phone connection. I'm not interested in begging for scraps of what Grandpa intended for me to have. If they want to change their decision, they can do that without my participation in family negotiations. You're being really stubborn about this, Liv. Family is more important than money. The irony of this statement coming from someone who was inheriting over $1 million that should have been split 3 ways was almost comical. You're absolutely right, Jake. Family is more important than money. That's exactly why I'm so disappointed that our parents chose money over treating me like family. I ended the call feeling even more resolved about the path I had chosen. The flight home from Afghanistan felt different than my return from previous deployments. Usually, I was eager to see family, excited about leave time, and optimistic about reconnecting with people I loved. This time, I felt like a soldier returning to enemy territory, armed with intelligence and prepared for combat, but not expecting a warm welcome. As the plane descended toward the airfield, I looked out the window at the American landscape and realized that I was finally ready to fight for myself with the same intensity and strategic thinking that I had brought to fighting for my country. My family had taught me that I didn't matter enough to be treated fairly, but the military had taught me that every soldier deserves backup. And sometimes, you have to be your own reinforcement. The documents in my carry-on bag represented more than legal evidence. They represented my grandfather's love, my own worth, and the future I intended to build regardless of my family's attempts to sabotage it. They had made their choice when they changed the will. Now it was time for me to make mine. The first thing I did after landing at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport was rent a car and drive straight to the law offices of Henderson Martinez and Associates. I had researched the firm extensively during my final weeks of deployment, and attorney Rebecca Henderson had the kind of reputation that made opposing counsel nervous. She specialized in estate litigation and had a track record of holding executors accountable for breaches of fiduciary duty. Her office was located in a gleaming high-rise in downtown Phoenix, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the desert city I had grown up in. The receptionist led me to a conference room where attorney Henderson was waiting, with a thick file folder and a digital recorder. She was a woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Ms. Martinez, I've reviewed the documentation you sent ahead, and I have to say, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of executor misconduct I've encountered in 20 years of practice. She gestured for me to sit across from her at the polished conference table. Your grandfather's will is unambiguous. Your parents' actions are well documented, and the financial records you've provided paint a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation. I had been prepared for this meeting for weeks, but hearing a legal professional validate my experience with such certainty was still emotionally overwhelming. What's our strongest legal argument? I asked, forcing myself to focus on strategy rather than vindication. We have several angles of attack, but the most straightforward is a petition to the probate court for removal of your parents as executors and enforcement of the original will terms. We can also pursue claims for breach of fiduciary duty, unjust, enrichment, and potentially fraud, depending on what we uncover during discovery. She opened the file folder and spread several documents across the table. The financial transfers you've made to your parents while they were planning to exclude you from inheritance could constitute fraudulent inducement, especially if we can prove they knew about their intention to change the will when they solicited your assistance. The legal terminology was precise and clinical, but the underlying reality was brutal. My parents had potentially committed fraud by accepting my money while planning to steal my inheritance. The family dysfunction I had normalized for years was actually criminal behavior when viewed through the lens of legal standards. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked, ready to understand the full scope of what I was undertaking. "I can file the initial petition within a week. Your parents will have 30 days to respond, and then we'll likely have a hearing within 60 to 90 days. Estate litigation moves quickly because courts understand that delays cause ongoing harm to beneficiaries." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Olivia, I need you to understand that this will be a nuclear option for your family relationships. Once we file this petition, there's no going back to normal family dynamics. Are you certain you want to proceed?" I had been asked this question multiple times by different people, and my answer had become clearer with each repetition. My family already ended our relationship when they decided to steal my inheritance. I'm just making sure there are consequences for that decision. Attorney Henderson nodded approvingly. "That's the attitude that wins cases. Let's get started." The petition was filed on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon my phone was exploding with calls and messages from my family. I let them all go to voicemail, following my attorney's advice to avoid direct contact until we had established our legal strategy. The messages were a fascinating study in manipulation, denial, and panic. My mother's first voicemail was pure emotional manipulation. "Olivia, honey, we just got some papers from a lawyer, and I don't understand what's happening. Please call me back. We love you, and we can work this out as a family." My father's message was more direct. "Olivia, this is ridiculous. You're taking this too far. Call me immediately so we can discuss this like adults." Jake's text was brief but telling. "Liv, Mom and Dad are freaking out. What the hell are you doing?" Emma's message was the most revealing. "Olivia, I don't understand why you're being so dramatic about this. Can't we just share the inheritance like mature adults?" The complete lack of acknowledgement that they had already made decisions about sharing the inheritance without consulting me was remarkable. Emma's suggestion that we could share like mature adults came after they had legally excluded me from any share whatsoever. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. I forwarded all the messages to my attorney, who reviewed them with professional interest. "These communications are actually helpful for our case," she explained. "They demonstrate that your family views the inheritance as something to be negotiated among themselves, rather than something that should be distributed according to your grandfather's explicit wishes." The following day, my parents drove to my apartment complex and waited in the parking lot for 3 hours, hoping to ambush me when I returned from errands. I spotted their car from a distance and called my attorney immediately. "They're violating the no-contact provisions we discussed," Attorney Henderson said firmly. "I'm going to send a cease and desist letter to their legal counsel today. Any further attempts to contact you directly will be considered harassment and could impact their standing with the court." Watching my parents sit in their car in my parking lot, looking like lost children rather than the powerful authority figures they had been throughout my childhood, was surreal. These were the people who had controlled my life for decades, who had made me feel guilty for wanting basic fairness, who had convinced me that their needs were more important than my rights. Now they looked small and desperate, reduced to stalking me in parking lots because they had lost their primary method of control. I called the apartment complex security office and reported the situation. Within an hour, a security guard had approached their car and informed them that they were trespassing on private property and needed to leave immediately. I watched from my window as they drove away, and I felt something I had never experienced in relation to my parents. Pity mixed with contempt. The legal process moved forward with mechanical precision. My parents hired their own attorney, a man named David Reeves who specialized in estate planning and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Attorney Henderson was unimpressed by his credentials and dismissive of his initial filings. Reeves is trying to argue that your parents had discretionary authority to modify the inheritance terms based on changed circumstances, she explained during our weekly strategy meeting. It's a weak argument that ignores the explicit language of your grandfather's will, but it's the best defense they have available. What kind of changed circumstances are they claiming? I asked, genuinely curious about how they plan to justify their actions. They're arguing that your military service and financial independence constitute changed circumstances that your grandfather couldn't have anticipated when he wrote the will. Attorney Henderson's tone was professionally neutral, but I could see the disdain in her eyes. They're also claiming that your recent behavior demonstrates emotional instability and poor judgment, which makes you unsuitable to inherit significant assets. The breathtaking audacity of this argument left me momentarily speechless. They were using my military service, the career I had chosen to serve my country, as evidence that I didn't deserve my inheritance. They were characterizing my decision to seek legal recourse for their betrayal as emotional instability rather than rational response to injustice. How strong is their argument? I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Legally, it's nonsense. Executors don't get to rewrite wills based on their personal opinions about beneficiaries' life choices. But it tells us something important about their mindset and strategy. They're going to try to make this about your character rather than their legal obligations. She made notes in her file. We need to be prepared for them to attack your military service, your financial requests for family assistance, and your decision to pursue legal action. The discovery process began 3 weeks after the initial filing, and it revealed information that exceeded even my worst expectations about my family's financial manipulation. Through subpoenas and document requests, we uncovered bank records, business documents, and correspondence that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic deception. The most damaging evidence came from email communications between my parents and their financial advisor, dating back to 2 years before my deployment. In these emails, they discussed strategies for managing Olivia's expectations regarding her inheritance and restructuring family assets to better reflect current realities. One email from my mother to the advisor was particularly illuminating. We need to be careful about how we handle Olivia's situation. She's contributed significant financial support to the family over the years, and she might feel entitled to more than we think is appropriate. David thinks we should start preparing her for a reduced role in the estate planning. My father's response was even more revealing. Olivia has always been independent and strong-willed. The military has only reinforced those tendencies. We need to make decisions that reflect what's best for the family as a whole, not what she might want individually. These communications proved several crucial facts. First, my parents had been planning to exclude me from inheritance for years, not months. Second, they had been accepting my financial assistance while simultaneously planning to reduce my role in estate planning. Third, they viewed my independence and strength as negative qualities that justified excluding me from family financial decisions. Attorney Henderson was professionally delighted by these discoveries. This correspondence establishes premeditation and bad faith. They weren't making emergency decisions in response to your deployment. They were executing a long-term plan to exclude you from your inheritance while continuing to accept your financial support. The business records were equally damaging. My father's construction company had indeed been struggling financially, but not because of market conditions or economic downturns. The records showed a pattern of poor decision-making, inflated expenses, and questionable business practices that had drained profitability for years. More importantly, the records revealed that my financial contributions had been used to subsidize my father's business mistakes rather than address genuine family emergencies. The $47,000 I had sent over the years had been used to cover business debts, pay for equipment purchases, and maintain my father's salary during periods when the company should have been restructuring or downsizing. Your parents essentially used you as an unsecured loan to prop up a failing business, Attorney Henderson explained. They were transferring your money into a business that was already struggling, while preserving the estate assets that were designated for your siblings. You were subsidizing their lifestyle and their mistakes, while they were planning to exclude you from any future benefit. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating, but also liberating. I had spent years questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or demanding too much from my family. The documentary evidence proved that my instincts had been correct all along. I wasn't imagining the unfairness or overreacting to normal family dynamics. I was responding appropriately to systematic financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. My parents' legal strategy became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against them. They filed motions to dismiss the case, claiming that I lacked standing to challenge their decisions as executors. They argued that my military service made me an absentee family member who had forfeited any right to input on family financial matters. They even suggested that my deployment pay made me wealthy enough that I didn't need inheritance money. Each of these arguments was systematically demolished by my attorney's responses. Military service didn't disqualify someone from inheritance rights. Physical absence didn't eliminate legal standing as a named beneficiary. Personal income didn't justify executors ignoring explicit will provisions. The most revealing aspect of their legal defense was how it mirrored their emotional manipulation tactics. They were trying to make the court case about my character, my choices, and my supposed greed, rather than about their legal obligations and documented misconduct. It was the same pattern I had experienced throughout my life, just translated into legal terminology. The breakthrough came during depositions, when my parents were required to testify under oath about their decision-making process and financial management. Under direct questioning from my attorney, their carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. My father was forced to admit that he had never consulted with me about major estate decisions, despite my status as a named beneficiary. He acknowledged that he had accepted my financial assistance while planning to exclude me from inheritance, but claimed that the two issues were unrelated. When pressed about the timing of these decisions, he became evasive and contradictory. My mother's testimony was even more damaging. She broke down during questioning about the family's financial situation, admitting that they had been living beyond their means for years and relying on my contributions to maintain their lifestyle. When asked about the email communications, discussing my reduced role in estate planning, she claimed not to remember writing them, despite the messages being sent from her personal email account. The most damaging moment came when my mother was asked directly why they had decided to exclude me from inheritance. Her answer, given under oath, was captured on the court reporter's transcript. Olivia doesn't need the money like Jake and Emma do. She's always been able to take care of herself. We thought the inheritance would be better used by the children who actually need our help. This statement revealed the fundamental flaw in their legal argument. They weren't acting as neutral executors carrying out my grandfather's wishes. They were making subjective judgments about who needed money more and redistributing assets accordingly. This was exactly the kind of behavior that constituted breach of fiduciary duty. Attorney Henderson was barely able to contain her satisfaction during the lunch break following my mother's testimony. That statement alone is worth the entire case. She just admitted under oath that they were redistributing your inheritance, based on their personal opinions about who needed money more. That's the textbook definition of executor misconduct. The depositions also revealed the extent to which my parents had been discussing my situation with other family members. Aunt testified that my parents had told her I was too independent and didn't appreciate family anymore. My uncle admitted that he had been informed about the will changes months before I was, and that he had been asked to support my parents' decision if I caused problems about the inheritance. This testimony established that my parents had been building a narrative about my character and worthiness for months, preparing family members to support their decision and isolate me if I objected. It was a coordinated campaign of reputation management designed to justify their betrayal and minimize potential family backlash. The pattern of manipulation was so systematic and comprehensive that it took my breath away. These weren't impulsive decisions made in response to my deployment. They were carefully planned strategies designed to exclude me from my inheritance while maintaining family support for their actions. Jake's deposition was particularly painful to watch. He admitted that he had known about the will changes for months before telling me, and that he had been specifically instructed by our parents not to discuss the matter with me until after the legal documents were signed. He also acknowledged that he had been promised a larger share of the business assets in exchange for supporting their decision. I felt bad about it, he testified, but Mom and Dad said it was better for the family overall. They said Olivia would understand eventually, and that she didn't really need the money anyway. The idea that I would understand eventually was particularly galling. They had expected me to accept their betrayal gracefully, to be grateful for whatever scraps they chose to offer, and to continue providing financial support, even after being excluded from inheritance. The level of entitlement and delusion was staggering. Emma's testimony was more defensive, but equally revealing. She claimed that she had been uncomfortable with the decision but had been afraid to oppose our parents. When asked why she hadn't warned me about the will changes, she said she had been told it was family business that didn't concern me until the legal documents were finalized. The irony was crushing. Decisions about my inheritance were family business that didn't concern me, but my financial contributions to solve family problems were always my responsibility. I was family when they needed money, but not family when they were distributing assets. As the depositions concluded and we prepared for trial, the full scope of my family's betrayal became clear. This wasn't just about money, though the financial theft was significant. This was about power, control, and the fundamental question of whether I would be treated as an equal member of the family or as a resource to be exploited and discarded. They had made their choice years ago, when they decided I was strong enough to handle their neglect and responsible enough to solve their problems, but not worthy enough to inherit what my grandfather had intended for me. Now they were about to face the consequences of that choice, and I was no longer the compliant daughter who would accept whatever treatment they chose to dish out. The trial date was set for 6 weeks later, and I spent that time preparing my testimony and emotionally processing the full extent of what had been done to me. I wasn't just fighting for money, I was fighting for recognition, respect, and the right to be treated as a full member of my own family. My parents made one final attempt to resolve the case outside of court, through their attorney's office. They offered a settlement that would give me a reduced share of the inheritance, contingent on my agreement not to pursue any claims for the money I had contributed over the years. The offer was designed to look generous while still punishing me for having the audacity to challenge their authority. I rejected the settlement without hesitation. After everything I had discovered about their systematic manipulation and betrayal, I wasn't interested in compromising or accepting partial justice. I wanted full enforcement of my grandfather's will and complete accountability for their misconduct. They still don't understand that this isn't a negotiation, I told my attorney. They think they can offer me a reduced inheritance and I'll be grateful for whatever they're willing to give me. They're about to learn that I'm not interested in their version of generosity. The trial was scheduled to begin on a Monday morning in late September, and I felt ready. I had the law on my side, comprehensive evidence of their misconduct, and the kind of strategic clarity that comes from finally understanding exactly who you're fighting and why. My family had taught me to be strong, disciplined, and self-reliant. Now I was going to use those qualities against them in ways they had never anticipated. The war they had started when they changed the will was about to end, but not in the way they had expected. They had underestimated the soldier they had helped create, and they were about to face the consequences of that miscalculation. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh, institutional tones. Judge Patricia Hawkins presided from behind an imposing bench, her gray hair pulled back severely, and her expression unreadable as she reviewed the case files. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Henderson, while my parents huddled with their lawyer at the defense table 20 feet away. This was the first time I had been in the same room with my family since returning from deployment, and the physical proximity felt surreal. These people had shaped my entire understanding of love, loyalty, and family obligation for 26 years. Now we were legal adversaries, separated by attorneys and court procedures, fighting over money and principles that should never have required judicial intervention. My mother looked older than I remembered, with new lines around her eyes and a nervous tremor in her hands as she shuffled through papers. My father sat rigidly upright, his jaw clenched in the stubborn expression I recognized from childhood arguments. Neither of them looked in my direction during the preliminary proceedings, as if acknowledging my presence would somehow legitimize my challenge to their authority. Judge Hawkins called the court to order and outlined the basic facts of the case. This is a petition to enforce the original terms of the will of Antonio Martinez, deceased, and to remove the current executors for alleged breach of fiduciary duty. The petitioner, Olivia Martinez, claims that the executors have exceeded their authority by modifying inheritance terms without legal justification. Attorney Henderson rose to present our opening statement, and her voice carried the confidence of someone who knew she held all the winning cards. Your Honor, this case is about a fundamental principle of estate law. Executors must carry out the testator's wishes as written, not substitute their own judgment about who deserves what. The evidence will show that the defendants have systematically violated their fiduciary duties while enriching themselves through the beneficiary's financial contributions. She outlined our case methodically, describing my grandfather's explicit will provisions, my parents' unauthorized changes, and the documented financial exploitation that had occurred over several years. Her presentation was clinical and devastating, stripping away all the emotional manipulation and family drama to reveal the bare legal facts. My parents' attorney, David Reeves, attempted to reframe the situation as a family dispute rather than a legal matter. Your Honor, this case represents a daughter's attempt to use the court system to punish her parents for making difficult family decisions. The defendants have acted within their authority as executors to modify distribution terms based on changed circumstances and the best interests of all beneficiaries. His argument was professionally delivered but fundamentally flawed, and I could see Judge Hawkins taking notes with increasing skepticism. The law didn't provide executors with authority to modify inheritance terms based on their personal opinions about beneficiaries' circumstances or worthiness. The first witness called was the estate's financial advisor, who testified about the management of my grandfather's assets since his death. Under questioning, he revealed that the estate had actually increased in value significantly over the past 5 years, generating substantial returns that contradicted my parents' claims of financial necessity. The estate assets have performed exceptionally well, he testified. The construction business is profitable, the rental properties are fully occupied, and the investment portfolio has outperformed market averages. There was never any financial justification for modifying the inheritance terms. This testimony demolished one of my parents' key arguments that changed financial circumstances had made equal distribution impractical or inadvisable. The estate was wealthy enough to provide each grandchild with more than my grandfather had originally envisioned, not less. Attorney Henderson then presented the email communications between my parents and their advisors, reading selected passages aloud to the court. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as she heard evidence of their premeditated plan to exclude me from inheritance while continuing to accept my financial assistance. When my mother took the witness stand, her composure crumbled almost, immediately under cross-examination. Attorney Henderson's questions were precise and relentless, forcing her to acknowledge facts that undermined her entire defense strategy. Mrs. Martinez, you testified that you removed your daughter from inheritance because she had become too independent. Can you explain how independence disqualifies someone from receiving what their grandfather explicitly left them? My mother's answer was rambling and contradictory, revealing the emotional rather than legal basis for their decisions. Olivia has always been different from Jake and Emma. She doesn't need us the way they do. We thought the money would be better used by the children who actually want to be part of this family. Are you testifying that military service indicates someone doesn't want to be part of their family? That's not what I meant. It's just that Olivia has her own life now, and Jake and Emma still need our guidance and support. Mrs. Martinez, while you were deciding that Olivia didn't need family support, were you accepting financial assistance from her? The question hung in the courtroom air like smoke from an explosion. My mother's face flushed red, and she stammered for several seconds before answering. That was different. Those were emergency situations where we needed help. How much money did Olivia send you over the past 5 years? I don't remember exactly. Attorney Henderson approached the witness stand with a thick folder of bank records. Your Honor, I'm presenting Exhibit 15, which documents $47,328 in transfers from the plaintiff to the defendants over a 5-year period. Mrs. Martinez, does this refresh your recollection? My mother stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, her face growing paler with each page. I suppose that sounds about right. So you accepted over $47,000 from a daughter who you claim doesn't want to be part of the family and doesn't need your support. She offered to help. We didn't force her to send money. But you did force her out of her inheritance without consulting her? We didn't force anything. We made a decision that we thought was best for everyone. Everyone except Olivia. The cross-examination continued for 2 hours, systematically destroying every justification my parents had offered for their actions. By the time my mother left the witness stand, she looked exhausted and defeated, her carefully constructed narrative lying in pieces around the courtroom. My father's testimony was more combative but equally damaging. He attempted to portray himself as a responsible executor, making difficult decisions for the family's benefit. But his answers revealed the same pattern of self-serving rationalization that had characterized my entire childhood. Under questioning about his business practices and use of my financial contributions, he became defensive and evasive. When confronted with evidence that my money had been used to subsidize his failing business decisions, he claimed that family members had an obligation to support each other during difficult times. Mr. Martinez, did you inform Olivia that her financial assistance was being used to cover business losses rather than genuine family emergencies? She knew we were having business difficulties. Did you specifically tell her that her money was being used to pay business debts and maintain your salary? The details weren't important. She was helping the family. While you were accepting her help for the family, were you planning to exclude her from the family inheritance? The question exposed the central hypocrisy of their position. They had been treating me as family when they needed money, but not as family when they were distributing assets. My father's answer was a masterpiece of circular logic and self-justification. We were making decisions based on what was best for everyone involved. Olivia has her military benefits and her own career. Jake and Emma need more support to get established in life. Mr. Martinez, who gave you the authority to decide who needs inherited money more than others? We're the executors. We have discretion in managing the estate. Do you have discretion to ignore the explicit terms of the will? My father's attorney objected at this point, but the damage was already done. Judge Hawkins had heard enough testimony to understand exactly what had happened and why. When I took the witness stand to testify on my own behalf, I felt strangely calm. This was the moment I had been preparing for since that devastating phone call in Afghanistan, and I was ready to tell my story with the same precision and clarity I had brought to military operations. Attorney Henderson guided me through my testimony methodically, establishing my relationship with my grandfather, my understanding of his wishes, and my financial contributions to the family over the years. I spoke directly to Judge Hawkins, maintaining eye contact and answering questions with military precision. Ms. Martinez, why did you send money to your parents while you were deployed? I believed they were experiencing genuine financial emergencies, and I wanted to help my family during difficult times. I trusted them to be honest with me about their needs and their intentions regarding the inheritance. How did you feel when you learned that you had been excluded from your grandfather's will? Betrayed. Not just because of the money, but because they had made this decision while I was serving my country and risking my life. They accepted my financial support while planning to exclude me from my grandfather's legacy. It felt like they had been using me. What do you hope to achieve through this legal action? I want my grandfather's wishes to be honored as he wrote them. He intended for his legacy to be shared equally among his grandchildren, regardless of our career choices or life paths. My parents don't have the right to override his explicit instructions based on their personal preferences. The cross-examination by my parents' attorney was an attempt to portray me as a greedy daughter using legal technicalities to punish her family for making difficult decisions. His questions were designed to make me appear ungrateful, vindictive, and materialistic. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that you're pursuing this lawsuit because you're angry about family decisions that didn't go your way? I'm pursuing this lawsuit because my parents violated their legal obligations as executors and breached their fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries. Couldn't this family dispute have been resolved through communication and compromise rather than expensive litigation? My parents made unilateral decisions about my inheritance without consulting me, and while accepting my financial assistance under false pretenses. There was nothing to communicate about after they had already signed legal documents excluding me. Don't you think your military salary and benefits make you less deserving of inheritance money than your siblings? This question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven my family's decision-making process. My military benefits are compensation I earned through service and sacrifice. They don't disqualify me from receiving what my grandfather explicitly left for me. My grandfather's will didn't include conditions based on career choices or income levels. The cross-examination continued for another hour, but I felt confident in my responses. Military training had taught me to remain calm under pressure and stick to facts rather than emotional reactions. Every question was answered directly and honestly, without defensiveness or hostility. After all testimony was concluded, both attorneys presented closing arguments that summarized their positions. Attorney Henderson's closing was a masterful synthesis of legal precedent and documented evidence, demonstrating conclusively that my parents had exceeded their authority and violated their fiduciary obligations. Your Honor, the law is clear. Executors must carry out the testator's wishes as written, not substitute their own judgment about who deserves what. The defendants have systematically violated this principle while enriching themselves through the beneficiary's financial contributions. Justice requires enforcement of the original will terms and removal of executors who have proven themselves unworthy of the trust placed in them. My parents' attorney made a final plea for judicial sympathy, arguing that family relationships were more important than legal technicalities and that the court should defer to parental judgment about what was best for their children. His argument was emotionally appealing but legally irrelevant. Judge Hawkins retired to consider her decision, and we waited in the courthouse hallway for what felt like an eternity. I sat on a wooden bench with my attorney, watching my parents huddle with their lawyer near the elevators. We were physically close but emotionally separated by an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal and litigation. After 90 minutes, the bailiff called us back into the courtroom. Judge Hawkins had prepared a written decision that she read aloud in a clear, authoritative voice that left no room for misinterpretation. After reviewing all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds that the defendants have exceeded their authority as executors and breached their fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries. The original will of Antonio Martinez was clear and unambiguous in its intention to provide equal inheritance to his 3 grandchildren. The defendants had no legal authority to modify these terms based on their personal opinions about the beneficiary's circumstances or worthiness. She continued reading, systematically dismantling every argument my parents had presented and establishing the legal precedent that would govern the resolution of the case. Furthermore, the court finds that the defendant's acceptance of significant financial assistance from the plaintiff while planning to exclude her from inheritance constitutes bad faith and potential fraudulent behavior. The documented pattern of financial exploitation undermines any claim that their actions were motivated by the best interests of all beneficiaries. The judge's decision was comprehensive and decisive. She ordered immediate enforcement of the BAW, original will terms, removal of my parents as executors, and appointment of a neutral third-party administrator to oversee estate distribution. She also ordered my parents to provide a full accounting of all estate assets and to reimburse the estate for any funds that had been improperly used. Most significantly, she ruled that I was entitled to recover the money I had contributed to my parents over the years, characterizing these payments as loans obtained under false pretenses that should be repaid from my parents' personal assets, rather than estate funds. The court awards judgment in favor of the plaintiff for the full amount of financial contributions made to the defendants, plus interest and attorney fees. The defendants are hereby removed as executors and barred from any further involvement in estate administration. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow rather than triumphant. I had won everything I had asked for, but the cost had been the complete destruction of my relationship with my family. My parents left the courtroom without speaking to me or making eye contact. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the legal proceedings and the public exposure of their betrayal. I felt no satisfaction in their humiliation, just a profound sadness that it had come to this. Attorney Henderson was professionally pleased with the outcome and began discussing next steps for estate administration and asset recovery. The legal machinery would continue grinding forward, converting my family's dysfunction into monetary damages and court orders. But the emotional work of processing what had happened would be mine alone. The months that followed the trial were a strange mixture of vindication and isolation. The new estate administrator was efficient and professional, working quickly to implement the court's orders and distribute assets according to my grandfather's original wishes. Within 6 months, I received a check for my full inheritance share, plus reimbursement for the money I had contributed to my parents over the years. The financial security was life-changing, but it came with a profound sense of loss. I had gained economic independence, but lost the family that had defined my entire identity for 26 years. The victory was complete from a legal standpoint, but emotionally it felt like surviving a war in which everyone I loved had been casualties. My parents made no attempt to contact me after the trial, apparently accepting that our relationship was irreparably damaged. Jake sent one text message expressing regret about how everything had turned out, but he made no effort to maintain any ongoing relationship. Emma posted cryptic social media messages about betrayal and family loyalty, but never reached out directly. I used part of my inheritance to buy a house in Colorado Springs, near the military base where I had been reassigned after returning from deployment. It was a modest 3-bedroom ranch with mountain views and enough space for a home office where I could work on the consulting business I was planning to start after completing my military service. The house was entirely mine, purchased with money that no one could take away or use as leverage against me. I decorated it slowly and carefully, choosing furniture and artwork that reflected my own tastes rather than family traditions or expectations. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something that belonged completely and exclusively to me. I also began therapy with a counselor who specialized in working with military personnel and family trauma. Dr. Sandra Chen was a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who had experience helping people process complex grief and betrayal. Our sessions became a weekly ritual of unpacking decades of emotional manipulation, and learning to recognize healthy relationship patterns. Olivia, you've spent your entire life being conditioned to prioritize other people's needs over your own well-being, she explained during one particularly insightful session. Your family trained you to accept less and give more, to be grateful for scraps of affection in exchange for constant service. Learning to value yourself appropriately is going to take time and practice. The therapy was difficult, but essential. Work. I had to examine every assumption I had made about love, loyalty, and family obligation. I had to learn the difference between genuine mutual support and exploitative manipulation. Most importantly, I had to develop the emotional vocabulary to understand that what had happened to me was abuse, not just family dysfunction. One of the most challenging aspects of my recovery was accepting that my parents had likely never loved me in the way I had understood love to work. They had valued my utility, appreciated my compliance, and enjoyed the benefits of my support, but they had never seen me as a person whose dreams and needs mattered as much as their own. This realization was devastating but also liberating. It freed me from the obligation to continue trying to earn love that had never been available on terms I could meet. It allowed me to stop interpreting their neglect as temporary oversight and start recognizing it as deliberate choice. I began building new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine reciprocity. I joined a veterans support group where I met other women who had faced similar challenges transitioning from military to civilian life. I volunteered with organizations that helped military families navigate legal and financial difficulties. I started dating cautiously, learning to recognize green flags as well as red flags in potential partners. Most importantly, I began developing a relationship with myself that wasn't based on productivity, service, or sacrifice. I learned to enjoy quiet evenings at home without feeling guilty about not helping someone else. I practiced saying no to requests that didn't align with my interests or values. I experimented with hobbies and activities that brought me joy, rather than serving some larger purpose. The process was uncomfortable at first because I had been conditioned to measure my worth by my usefulness to others. Learning to value myself as an individual rather than as a resource took considerable practice and patience. 2 years after the trial, I received an unexpected letter from my grandfather's elderly sister, my great-aunt Maria, who lived in Tucson. She had heard about the legal proceedings through family gossip and wanted to share some perspective that she thought might be helpful. "Mija, your grandfather talked to me many times about his concerns for you," she wrote in careful handwriting. "He saw how your parents treated you differently from Jake and Emma, how they expected more from you and gave you less in return. He was very specific about the will because he wanted to make sure you would have security and independence when you got older." The letter included photographs of my grandfather and me from when I was a child, images I had never seen before. In the pictures, he was looking at me with obvious pride and affection, and I was gazing up at him with complete trust and adoration. Seeing these images reminded me that I had been genuinely loved by someone in my family, even if that love hadn't been preserved or honored by the people who should have protected it. "He told me once that you reminded him of himself when he was young," Aunt Maria continued. "Strong, determined, willing to work hard for what you wanted. He said you were going to do great things with your life, but he worried that your parents would try to hold you back or use you for their own purposes. That's why he made sure the will was so clear about equal distribution." This letter provided context that helped me understand my grandfather's intentions and my own family history more clearly. He had recognized the dysfunctional patterns that I had experienced as normal, and he had tried to protect me through his estate planning. My parents had violated not just legal obligations, but also his specific wishes and concerns. I framed one of the photographs and placed it on my mantle, a reminder that my grandfather's love had been real, and that fighting for his wishes had honored both his memory and my own worth. The legal victory had been about money and justice, but the deeper victory was about recognizing that I deserved better treatment than I had received. 3 years after the trial, I left active military duty and launched my consulting business, specializing in helping small businesses with project management and operational efficiency. The skills I had developed in the military translated well to civilian business challenges, and the financial security from my inheritance allowed me to be selective about clients and projects. I also began speaking at events for military spouses and veterans about financial literacy and family relationship boundaries. My story resonated with many people who had experienced similar exploitation or manipulation from family members. Sharing my experience helped others recognize their own situations and consider their options for addressing them. One evening, while reviewing business plans in my home office, I received an unexpected phone call from Jake. It was the first direct contact we had had since the trial, and his voice sounded older and more subdued than I remembered. "Liv, I know this is probably weird, but I wanted to reach out and talk to you about everything that happened." His tone was cautious, almost nervous. "I've been thinking a lot about the family situation, and I realize I handled things really poorly." I listened without responding immediately, curious about what had prompted this contact after years of silence. "The truth is, Mom and Dad have been pretty miserable since the trial. The whole thing really affected them, and they've been having financial problems without your support. Emma's business never really took off, and Dad's company is struggling again." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "I think they realize they made a huge mistake, but they're too proud to admit it. This information was interesting, but not particularly surprising. My parents had built their lifestyle around financial assistance from me while simultaneously planning to exclude me from inheritance. The loss of both income streams would naturally create difficulties. Jake, I appreciate you calling, but I'm not interested in resuming financial support for people who betrayed my trust and stole my inheritance." My response was calm, but firm. If they're having financial difficulties, they can address them the same way other adults do through budgeting, downsizing, or finding additional income sources. "I understand why you feel that way, but they're still our parents. Don't you think family is more important than money?" The question echoed arguments I had heard throughout the legal proceedings, and my answer had become clearer with time and distance. "Jake, they're the ones who decided money was more important than family when they cut me out of the will. I didn't make that choice, they did. I'm just living with the consequences of their decision." I could hear him sigh heavily over the phone connection. If they want to repair our relationship, they need to start with genuine acknowledgement of what they did and why it was wrong. Until that happens, there's nothing to discuss. The conversation ended without resolution, but I felt satisfied with my response. I had learned to set boundaries that protected my well-being rather than enabling other people's dysfunction. The old Olivia would have felt guilty about my parents' financial difficulties and considered sending money to help. The new Olivia recognized that their problems were consequences of their own choices and not my responsibility to solve. 6 months later, I met Marcus Rodriguez, a fellow veteran who had transitioned from military to civilian life with his own consulting business focused on cybersecurity. We connected initially through professional networking, but developed a personal relationship based on shared values and genuine mutual respect. Marcus had his own stories of family complexity and personal growth, but he had learned healthy relationship patterns through therapy and intentional work on himself. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, with both of us being explicit about boundaries, expectations, and goals. For the first time in my life, I was in a relationship where I wasn't expected to sacrifice my own interests for someone else's benefit. Marcus supported my business goals, respected my independence, and contributed equally to our shared expenses and responsibilities. The reciprocity felt foreign at first, but I learned to accept care and support without feeling obligated to earn it through service. We moved in together after dating for 2 years, combining our households and beginning to build a life partnership based on equality and mutual respect. The house became our space rather than my space, but the transition felt natural and comfortable rather than threatening or compromising. Marcus understood my family history and respected my boundaries around contact with my parents and siblings. He never pressured me to reconcile or suggested that I should be more forgiving. Instead, he supported my healing process and helped me continue developing healthy relationship patterns. 5 years after the trial, I received a formal letter from my mother, delivered through an attorney rather than directly. The letter was carefully worded and obviously drafted with legal counsel, but it represented the first acknowledgement I had received of their misconduct. Olivia, your father and I have spent considerable time reflecting on our actions regarding your grandfather's will and our treatment of you over the years. We recognize that we made serious mistakes that caused you significant harm, both financially and emotionally. We violated your trust and failed to honor your grandfather's wishes and your contributions to our family. The letter continued with specific acknowledgments of their financial exploitation, their manipulation of inheritance, terms, and their failure to communicate honestly about their intentions. It was the kind of comprehensive admission that I had hoped for, but never expected to receive. We understand that our actions have probably damaged our relationship permanently, and we don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. We simply wanted you to know that we recognize the extent of our wrongdoing and that we take full responsibility for the consequences of our choices. The letter concluded with information about their current situation and a request that I consider limited contact in the future, if and when I felt ready for such communication. They had downsized their lifestyle significantly, moved to a smaller house, and were managing their finances more responsibly. Emma had found stable employment, and Jake was working to rebuild his relationship with them on healthier terms. I read the letter several times, analyzing it for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. The tone seemed genuinely remorseful rather than strategic, and the specific acknowledgments addressed most of the issues that had driven the legal dispute. It felt like a sincere attempt at accountability rather than another attempt to manipulate me into resuming financial support. After discussing it with my therapist and Marcus, I decided to respond with a brief acknowledgement that left the door open for future communication without committing to anything specific. I wasn't ready for reconciliation, but I was willing to consider the possibility that people could change and grow if they demonstrated sustained commitment to healthier patterns. I received your letter and appreciate the acknowledgments you made about your past actions. Rebuilding trust would require consistent demonstration of changed behavior over time, not just written apologies. I'm not ready for regular contact, but I'm willing to consider limited communication if it's respectful and doesn't involve requests for financial assistance or emotional support. The response was measured and conditional, protecting my boundaries while acknowledging their attempt at accountability. I sent it through my attorney to maintain appropriate distance and documentation. 7 years after the trial, I married Marcus in a small ceremony, attended by chosen family rather than blood relatives. The wedding party included fellow veterans, business colleagues, and friends who had supported my healing journey. My biological family was not invited, but their absence felt appropriate rather than painful. The ceremony took place in the backyard of our home, surrounded by the garden we had planted together and the life we had built through mutual respect and genuine partnership. The officiant spoke about the importance of choosing family and creating relationships based on shared values rather than inherited obligations. Our honeymoon was a 2-week trip to New Zealand, funded by my consulting business profits, and planned around activities we both enjoyed, rather than family expectations or traditions. It was the first major life event I had celebrated without feeling guilty about excluding family members or compromising my own preferences to accommodate others. 10 years after the trial, I received news through mutual acquaintances that my father had passed away from a heart attack. The information came through Aunt Maria, who had maintained limited contact with both sides of the family and served as an informal liaison for major news. I felt complicated emotions about his death, sadness for the relationship we had never been able to build, regret about the years of conflict and estrangement, but also a kind of relief that the chapter was finally closed. Marcus supported me through the grieving process, recognizing that loss can be complex even when relationships have been damaged or severed. I did not attend the funeral, but I sent flowers with a card that simply said, "Condolences to the family." It felt like an appropriate gesture that acknowledged the loss without pretending that our relationship had been something other than what it was. My mother sent a brief note thanking me for the flowers and updating me on family circumstances. My father had left behind some debt, but also some assets, and she was managing the transition to widowhood with support from Jake and Emma. The tone was informational rather than emotional, respecting the boundaries I had established while maintaining minimal connection. Today, 15 years after that devastating phone call in Afghanistan, I run a successful consulting business that employs 12 people and serves clients across multiple industries. I own my home outright, have substantial savings and investments, and have built a life that reflects my own values and priorities rather than inherited expectations or obligations. Marcus and I have been married for 8 years and have created a partnership based on equality, respect, and genuine mutual support. We travel regularly, pursue individual hobbies and interests, and make decisions together based on what works best for both of us rather than external pressures or traditional expectations. I maintain limited but cordial contact with my mother and siblings through holiday cards and occasional updates about major life events. The relationships are polite but distant, lacking the intimacy and trust that would be required for deeper connection. This feels appropriate given our history and the boundaries necessary to protect my well-being. The inheritance money was used wisely to build the life my grandfather had envisioned for me, a life of independence, security, and freedom to make choices based on my own goals rather than family obligations. His legacy wasn't just financial. It was the recognition that I deserved better treatment than I had received and the resources to demand that treatment. I still volunteer with organizations that help military families and veterans navigate complex legal and financial situations. My story has become a resource for other people who have experienced family exploitation or manipulation, demonstrating that it's possible to break free from toxic patterns and build healthier relationships. The greatest victory wasn't the money or the legal vindication. It was learning to value myself appropriately and refusing to accept treatment that didn't reflect that value. My family taught me to be strong, independent, and resilient, but they intended those qualities to serve their purposes rather than my own. The real triumph was turning those strengths toward building a life that honored my own worth and potential. Sometimes people ask if I regret pursuing legal action against my family, if I think the financial gain was worth the relationship loss. The question reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually happened. I didn't choose money over family. My family chose money over me when they decided to steal my inheritance while accepting my financial support. I simply refused to accept their choice passively and insisted on consequences for their actions. The relationships that were lost weren't based on genuine love or respect. They were based on my willingness to be exploited and their expectation that I would continue accepting whatever treatment they chose to offer. The life I've built since then is proof that my grandfather's faith in me was justified and that his investment in my future was worthwhile. I am exactly the kind of person he hoped I would become: independent, successful, and strong enough to demand fair treatment from everyone in my life, including family. Standing on my back deck this evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, I feel grateful for the journey that brought me here. It wasn't the family story I had imagined as a child, but it was the story I needed to live to become the person I was meant to be. The house is quiet except for the sounds of Marcus cooking dinner in the kitchen and our dog playing in the yard. This is my family now chosen, built on mutual respect, and impossible to take away through legal documents or manipulation. It's the family my grandfather would have wanted for me, and the life I finally learned I deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.